The summer heat of the frontier land pressed down like a curse from the heavens. Dust swirled in golden spirals across the cracked earth of Bitter Creek, a tiny mining town that time had nearly forgotten. The once bustling streets, now lined with shuttered storefronts and leaning signs, felt more like a ghost's whisper than a living town. Still, a small crowd had gathered, ranchers, drifters, and a few saloon folk drawn not by the promise of gold or grain, but by something darker, something shameful, something cheap. A rickety wagon creaked as it was backed into the center of the square. It bore no horses, just a rough-hewn platform and a girl standing atop it barefoot, bound at the wrists, with dirt smeared across the hem of her faded calico dress. Her auburn hair had once been brushed, perhaps braided with care, but now it clung to her face like tangled threads. The girl was perhaps 19, no more than 20, but there was a fire in her gaze that dared anyone to pity her. "Name's Ellie Mae Harper," the auctioneer drawled, a sweat-stained man with yellow teeth and a voice like a rusted gate hinge. "Belonged to her daddy, who died owing more than his weight in whiskey. Debt's gotta be paid." The girl said nothing. She stood tall, though the morning sun made her sway. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks were hollow, but her back remained straight and her green eyes didn't blink. The crowd was quiet. Not even the drunkards from the saloon offered crude jokes. Perhaps it was guilt. Or perhaps they knew a soul who'd ended up like Ellie Mae, sold, forgotten, bartered for like cattle. But none dared meet her gaze. They looked at her feet, or at the sky, or at the dirt. "Well?" the auctioneer barked. "Can cook, clean, even sing if you don't mind it a little off-key. What am I bid? Silence? $1? The town sheriff muttered, "Not worth the trouble, poor thing." A man in a worn suit chuckled. "Too wild. Look at her eyes, she'd bite before she'd serve." The auctioneer grew irritated. "Come on now, young, strong. That's only $2. Surely someone's got 2 coins to spare." The silence was broken by the slow, deliberate creak of worn leather boots walking across dry earth. Heads turned. From between the shadows of the livery barn and blacksmith shop, a tall, broad-shouldered figure emerged. He moved like a bear, slow but sure, powerful but quiet. A thick coat of dust clung to his duster, and his wide-brimmed hat shadowed a face half hidden behind a shaggy brown beard. A Winchester rifle was slung across his back. No one spoke his name aloud, but everyone in Bitter Creek knew of him: Gideon Thorne, the mountain man who hadn't set foot in town for 3 years. Some said he'd lost his wife to the fever. Others said he had killed men with his bare hands in a war no one remembered. No one ever asked. No one dared. He stepped forward until he stood 10 feet from the wagon. His gaze didn't linger long on the girl, just enough to see the bruises on her arms, the cracked lips, the chains. Then he looked to the auctioneer. $2, he said, voice low, like thunder crawling through canyon walls. The crowd gasped. Someone snorted a laugh, thinking he was joking. But Gideon didn't smile. The auctioneer blinked. "That all, Mr. Thorne? That's what she's worth to you," he said, and dropped 2 silver coins into the dust. The auctioneer didn't argue. He took them and handed over a folded slip of paper, a legal contract scrawled in crooked ink. "Yours. Now, do what you like with her." Gideon turned toward the wagon. Ellie's eyes met his. There was no fear in her, just confusion. Maybe disappointment, maybe hope, but no trust. He reached up and cut the rope at her wrists with a bone-handled knife. She didn't thank him, just rubbed her wrists in silence. "You comin'?" he said, and turned his back to her, already walking away. "What are you going to do with me?" She asked loudly. He didn't turn around. "You'll cook, clean, chop wood if you can. Cabin's 5 hours up the ridge. Keep up or get lost." The crowd watched in stunned silence as the girl climbed down from the wagon, hesitated only once, and then began following the mountain man out of town. Her bare feet kicked up dust as she walked behind him, head held high, pride wrapped around her like armor. Not a word was spoken between them for miles. The town faded behind them, and the wild stretched before them, untamed, uncertain, but in that silence something began. Not love, not yet, but something raw, something real. And it started with 2 coins and a girl no one wanted, except the one man who didn't ask anything from her except to come with him. The journey into the mountains was long, silent, and steep. The world of men, the town, the saloons, the stairs melted away behind Ellie as she followed Gideon Thorne into the wilderness. Every mile felt like stepping into a different time, a different world. Trees towered overhead like cathedral pillars, their pine-scented breath sharp in her lungs. The dirt path twisted and curled, growing thinner as the air grew colder, the wind louder and the sun dimmer behind the canopy of evergreens. Ellie didn't speak. She was too tired, too sore, too confused to try. And Gideon never invited words. He moved like a man who had lived too long in silence to remember how to break it. Occasionally, he looked back just to check she hadn't fallen behind. That was the extent of their communication. No questions. No answers. Only the steady rhythm of boots crunching gravel and the sound of breath turning to mist in the thin mountain air. By the time they reached his cabin, Ellie's legs were shaking and her bare feet raw. The cabin itself was modest but sturdy, built from hand-hewn logs and stone, nestled against the slope of a steep ridge with a creek winding nearby. Smoke curled from a crooked chimney. A small shed leaned to one side, its roof patched with bark. The front porch sagged, but it held a rocking chair and a stack of firewood neatly arranged. Gideon opened the door without ceremony. Inside, he said. She entered and was hit with the scent of pine, tobacco, and something faintly medicinal. The cabin had a single main room with a bed in the corner, a stone fireplace crackling low, a small kitchen table, and shelves full of traps, ropes, and tools. There were no frills, no curtains, no softness, just function. "You can take the bed," he muttered, taking off his rifle and setting it by the door. "I sleep on the floor." Ellie didn't argue. She stood near the fire, letting the warmth soak into her bones. Her limbs trembled, and her throat ached from thirst. Still, she asked, "Where's the bucket?" Gideon glanced up. "For water," she clarified. He pointed outside toward the creek. "You'll find a tin pail near the stump." She went without another word. In the days that followed, they settled into an uneasy routine, strangers orbiting around the same fire. Ellie woke early and fetched water. She learned quickly that mountain life didn't wait for the weak. The cold stung her fingers, the wood was heavy, and her city-learned skills meant little in the wilderness. Gideon, meanwhile, went out at dawn and returned near dusk. Sometimes he brought back rabbits or venison, sometimes nothing at all. He never explained where he went or what he did. He simply handed her game to skin or cook, then sat at the table with a mug of strong tea and stared into the fire. Like it spoke secrets only he could hear. It was during one of those long silences that Ellie noticed the grave. It sat behind the cabin, marked only by a cross made of 2 crooked sticks bound with twine. Wildflowers had grown around it. She saw him there once, kneeling, just kneeling, no words, no tears, just stillness. She didn't ask about it. Not yet. As days turned into weeks, the quiet between them started to change. It wasn't warmer, just less sharp, less like the edge of a blade and more like the hush of snowfall. Ellie found herself humming as she stirred stew or swept the porch. Gideon didn't complain. Once, she caught him tapping his foot to her tune. The first time he spoke more than 3 words, it startled her. You ever fire a rifle? He asked one morning as she chopped kindling. She looked up, sweating. No, I've never held one. Come on then, he said, tossing her his old Winchester. Time you learn. The lesson was clumsy. The recoil bruised her shoulder. But she smiled. For the first time in weeks, she felt useful. He carved her a small wooden fox the next day. Left it by her pillow without a note. She found it and held it like it was something sacred. Their days became a dance of habit. She cooked. He hunted. She cleaned. He chopped. They rarely spoke of the past. She didn't ask about the woman buried behind the cabin. He didn't ask what had happened to her parents or why her hand sometimes trembled in her sleep. Ellie noticed things. She noticed how he never raised his voice, never slammed a door. How he rescued a bluebird with a broken wing and fed it, until it flew again. How he mended his boots with care and always offered her the last piece of jerky. She also noticed how he flinched at loud noises. How he sometimes disappeared into the woods for hours after waking from dreams that made him shout. She never pressed. But she stayed close when he returned. One evening, a snowstorm rolled in. The cabin howled under the weight of wind and ice. Ellie wrapped herself in blankets by the hearth. Gideon sat nearby, whittling silently. She glanced at him, then to the fire and whispered, "Who was she?" He froze. The knife paused mid-cut. The woman buried outside. He said nothing for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke. Her name was Clara. She was my wife. Ellie waited. The silence stretched like cold water. Then she died up here. Fever. Winter came early that year. I couldn't get her to town in time. I'm sorry, she said. He nodded once. Me too. She reached out just enough to let her fingers graze his sleeve. Not a gesture of romance, just understanding, shared grief. A bridge across loneliness. Later that night, she watched him stare at the fire like it held all his regrets. She wondered if she would ever mean anything to him, or if she was just a shadow moving through his broken life. Still, when he handed her a second blanket before retreating to the floor, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't respond. But in the flicker of firelight, she thought she saw the ghost of a smile. Winter clung to the mountains like a jealous lover, draping the ridges in endless white and silencing the forests beneath a thick quilt of snow. The air turned sharp as glass, brittle enough to sting the lungs with every breath. In Gideon Thorne's cabin, firelight flickered against log walls, casting long shadows that danced across the room like echoes of things long buried. Outside, the world lay frozen. But inside that single-room cabin something began to warm. Ellie Mae had stopped, counting the days. Time in the mountains didn't move in hours or weeks. It passed with the chopping of wood, the melting of icicles, the hiss of soup bubbling over the fire, the rhythm of boots at the door when Gideon came home from his long, silent treks into the woods. But something was different now. He looked at her longer. He spoke, not often, but with weight. One morning, as she laid out biscuits and boiled coffee, he remarked in his graveled voice, "Smells like home in here." She turned sharply, startled. It wasn't just the words, it was how he said them. Like they meant something. Like they hadn't been said aloud in years. She smiled that morning. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel forced. Ellie began to hum as she worked. Old songs she half remembered from childhood. Folk lullabies her mother used to sing while washing clothes or braiding her hair. She didn't mean to draw attention. It was just something she did to feel less lonely. But one evening, as she sat near the hearth, stitching a tear in one of Gideon's shirts, she started to sing. Not loud. Just softly. Her voice carried through the cabin like smoke, thin and warm. She didn't even realize she was doing it until she looked up and saw Gideon standing at the door, unmoving. His arms hung at his sides, fists clenched. His eyes not hard this time, but haunted. "You sing," he said, almost like it hurt. "Used to," she replied. He sat down slowly in his chair near the fire and said nothing for a long time. Then, without looking at her, he said, "She sang too, Clara." Ellie nodded and returned to her stitching. Her voice stayed quiet after that, but the melody lingered like something sacred had been stirred awake. Over the next few days, a new rhythm unfolded. Gideon began teaching her things: how to load a rifle properly, how to read tracks in the snow, how to tell the difference between rabbit and fox prints. At first, he was short-tempered when she struggled, but then he saw the determination in her, the fire behind her eyes, the same fire that had burned when she stood on that auction block, hands bound, spine unbowed. "You ain't like most," he said once as they trudged through knee-deep snow. "Most would have run back to town. There's nothing back there for me," she replied. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, but something had shifted between them. Not just understanding, something deeper, warmer. That evening, he handed her a small bundle wrapped in old cloth. She opened it and found a wooden fox carved with surprising delicacy. Its eyes were small beads, its tail curled with elegance. "I thought you should have it," he muttered, awkward. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Did you carve it?" He nodded. "Foxes are clever, quick, survivors." She didn't say, "Thank you." She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. A light touch, nothing more. But it burned in his skin like a spark. The next morning, a wolf pack circled near the cabin. Their howls broke the morning calm, and Gideon rushed out with his rifle. Ellie followed without hesitation. Together, they drove them off shouting, firing shots, banging pots to scare them. One young wolf came too close, and Gideon shielded Ellie with his body. The creature lunged and scratched his arm before retreating into the trees. Inside, Ellie cleaned the wound while Gideon winced but said nothing. She dabbed alcohol gently, then wrapped it with fresh cloth. Her hands shook. "Didn't have to protect me like that," she whispered. He looked at her then, eyes dark but honest. "I did." She pressed her forehead against his shoulder and whispered, "You saved me." He didn't move, just murmured, "You saved me first." They sat like that for a long time, no longer strangers, no longer captor and purchased servant, but something slowly becoming whole. As the storm outside howled, the fire inside roared brighter. Their dinners grew quieter but more peaceful. They shared smiles now, even laughter. Ellie told stories of her mother's pies, her father's fiddle, the dream she once had of seeing the sea. Gideon listened, really listened, nodding or chuckling, when appropriate. Once, he even told a story of Clara, how she loved lilacs, how she once got lost chasing a butterfly. He smiled softly when he spoke of her. There was no bitterness, just longing, acceptance. Ellie never tried to replace Clara. But she did become something new. Not a ghost, not a placeholder, something real. Someone alive. One snowy night, she stood by the window, staring out into the white landscape. She whispered, more to herself than anyone, "I feel like I'm finally breathing." Gideon stood behind her quietly, then said, "So do I." He touched her hand, not with hunger, not with possession, but with reverence, like she was something fragile that could survive the winter and bloom. They didn't kiss. Not yet, but they didn't need to. That touch was the first promise, the first flicker of something sacred, a fire that neither frost nor sorrow could extinguish. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it arrived like a hymn. Snow melted into silver rivulets, feeding the creek that ran beside the cabin. The pines breathed deeply again, shedding their coats of ice, and the wildflowers small. Defiant things poked up from the soil like promises. In the clearing, the air softened. The silence wasn't so heavy anymore. For Gideon and Ellie, life had settled into something neither had expected. Peace. Gideon's eyes weren't always clouded with pain now. They crinkled at the corners sometimes when she laughed. Ellie's voice had grown stronger, and she no longer flinched when the wind rattled the shutters. The cabin had changed to becoming more than a shelter. It was a home. Books appeared, things Gideon hadn't touched in years. Ellie dusted them off, reading by lantern light. She brought color to the walls with dried flowers and humming tunes while sweeping. They began planting vegetables, herbs. Hope. They laughed more. Danced once. Clumsily, barefoot on the porch to no music but the wind. Gideon even let her teach him a little melody on a mouth harp. "You've got bear paws," she teased. He smiled and said, "And you've got a lion's heart." But just as new life took root, old shadows stirred. One morning, a rider came up the trail, a puff of dust trailing behind him. Ellie spotted him through the trees while collecting eggs. Her stomach dropped. She knew the broad shoulders, the crooked hat, the way he spat like he owned the ground. Sheriff Oates. He hadn't changed much. Same smug grin beneath a heavy mustache. Same black badge. Same scent of stale whiskey and cruelty. He dismounted slow and lazy, like he had all the time in the world. Well, he drawled, stepping onto the porch. A little bird told. "Me, you're alive and well, Ellie Mae Harper. Didn't expect you up here, shacked up with a mountain ghost." Gideon stepped out, rifle slung over one shoulder, jaw clenched. "She's not shacked up. She's under my roof. That's all you need to know." Oates' eyes slid from Gideon to Ellie like a butcher appraising meat. "She's still bound by contract. That piece of paper you got ain't worth a damn now. Town council says she's owed to the state until her father's debts are cleared. And someone down in Bitter Creek just offered to pay triple for her." Ellie's breath caught. "I'm not property." "To the law you are," Oates said, flicking something off his coat. "Unless your mountain man here wants to make it official. Otherwise, I'm tacking you back." Gideon stepped forward. "She's not going anywhere." "Then I'll be back with more than just a badge." He leaned in close to Ellie. "You can run, girl, but the law don't forget." And just like that, he was gone, riding back into the pines, leaving a silence behind that felt heavier than any snowfall. Ellie sat by the fire that night, arms wrapped around her knees. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that in her life. Instead, she stared into the flames and said quietly, "I don't want to run anymore." Gideon sat beside her, hands clasped, voice thick. "You won't," but he saw it deep in her eyes. The fear, the resignation, the guilt. "You didn't ask for any of this," she whispered. "I didn't," he admitted, "but I'm damn glad it happened." She shook her head. "I'm just trouble. You were at peace before me." He looked at her then, not with pity, but with conviction. "You call this peace?" He gestured to the cabin, to the warmth, the life in it. "This is more than I ever had." The next day, Ellie was gone. She left before dawn, leaving only a note scribbled on the back of a grocery list. "Don't fight for me. It's not worth it. Thank you for everything." Gideon stood in the doorway, wind tugging at his coat, reading those words until they blurred. She was trying to protect him. Again, he slammed his fist against the doorframe and roared once, loud enough to startle birds from the trees. Then, without hesitation, he threw on his rifle and coat and began to pack, because the girl who had taught him to live, again had just walked back into the fire, and he was not about to let her burn. Bitter Creek hadn't changed much in the months since Ellie had last stood on its broken boardwalks. Same leaning saloon, same dust-choked church bell that never rang, same judgmental stares from behind grimy windows. But something inside Ellie Mae Harper had changed, and that made all the difference. She walked through town not as a girl sold for $2, but as a woman who had learned what it felt like to be safe, to be seen. Still, every step back toward the jailhouse, toward the cruel familiarity of Sheriff Oates' world, felt like shackles tightening again. She hadn't wanted to leave the cabin. She hadn't wanted to leave him. But when she'd heard Oates talk of coming back with armed men, fire, and ropes, she couldn't bear the thought of Gideon losing his quiet world, maybe even his life, because of her. "I'm doing this for him," she whispered as she surrendered herself. Oates greeted her with the glee of a snake spotting a mouse in winter. He didn't even pretend to be lawful anymore. "Smart girl," he drawled, his breath sour as rot. "Too bad it took you this long to remember your place." He locked her in the old saloon's attic, a place barely fit for rats. No windows, no mattress, just floorboards and the stink of old ale. She wasn't made to serve drinks this time. She was made to wait until the buyer arrived. Ellie didn't know who it was, only that he'd paid more than anyone ever had for her. And this time, there was no contract. No law, just a sale. Pure and final. She sat curled near the wall, hands folded, trying not to break. Trying not to. Think of the sound of wind between the trees, or the way Gideon's voice had softened when he read aloud from that worn Bible, or the way the wooden fox he'd carved still sat in her skirt pocket, close to her heart. Every hour that passed chipped at her strength. Still, she didn't regret leaving. If Gideon was safe, it was worth the pain. She would have done anything to protect him, but miles away, deep in the pines, Gideon Thorne was not safe. He was raging. He'd searched for her footprints in the snow, found the broken twig at the tree line, the faint scuff of her boots headed downhill. She had left without a horse, without a coat. In the half-darkness of morning, the wind roared in the trees, but inside him, something roared louder. She had run to save him. And now she was alone. Gideon didn't pack food. He didn't pack clothes. He rode down the mountain with nothing but his rifle, a single flask of water, and a promise burning in his chest. I will not lose her. By the time he reached Bitter Creek, night had fallen and storm clouds loomed overhead. His arrival wasn't quiet. Hooves thundered through the streets like war drums. He dismounted without tying his horse and walked straight toward the sheriff's office, fire in his eyes, boots heavy with purpose. Doors slammed. Curtains twitched. Men with whiskey breath and unfinished guilt stepped aside as the mountain man passed, a legend come to life. Oates, who had been sipping from a bottle inside, chuckled when the door creaked open. "Well, if it ain't the woodsman." Gideon stepped inside, closed the door behind him. The room fell silent. "I've come for her," he said. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "She's been bought. That girl don't belong to you anymore." Gideon didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, just stared at the man with eyes cold enough to silence thunder. "She never belonged to me, but she damn sure doesn't belong to you." The sheriff reached for his pistol. Gideon moved faster, got the butt of the mountain rifle, hit the sheriff's hand before the gun left its holster. Bones cracked. Oates screamed. Then Gideon drove him into the desk with a single punch that shook the whole room. The gun clattered to the floor, and Gideon kicked it away. He didn't kill him. Didn't have to. "Where is she?" Gideon asked. "Upstairs. The attic of the saloon." A place no man with honor dared to look. He stormed out before the sheriff even fell. Hit the floor. He crossed the street in long strides, kicked open the saloon door. The bartender stepped back, hands raised. The piano player froze mid-note. Men stumbled out of their chairs, unsure whether to run or draw. "I'm only here for one thing," Gideon growled. "No one stops me, no one dies." He charged up the stairs, broke the attic lock with his shoulder, and found her half asleep, curled in the dark, pale and frightened. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she whispered, "You came." He dropped to his knees, pulled her into his arms. "I told you, you don't run from me. Not ever again." Tears came then, sudden and hot, falling against his shoulder as she clutched him like the world was breaking. "I didn't want them to hurt you. I'd rather burn the town than lose you." And he meant it. He helped her down the stairs, past the stunned patrons, past the rain now pouring outside. He didn't look back, didn't say a word. He mounted his horse, pulled her up behind him, and rode straight into the storm. No law. No sheriff, no whispered gossip from behind dusty windows could stop them now. She had given herself up for him. Now he had torn down the world to take her back. They rode through the storm like spirits defying the world. Rain poured in sheets, washing away the dust of Bitter Creek, soaking into the earth as if the land itself was trying to cleanse the sins it had witnessed. The wind screamed through the trees, but Ellie clung to Gideon's back, her arms around him, her cheek pressed between his shoulder blades. She didn't need to ask where they were going. She already knew. Home. The cabin appeared out of the mist like a lighthouse solid, warm and waiting. Smoke still rose from the chimney. The fire had never gone out. When they stepped inside, dripping and silent, it felt like they had both crossed some vast, invisible threshold. Gideon lit new candles. Ellie shivered beside the fire, and he brought her dry clothes, a blanket, and a steaming mug of tea. He said nothing of what had happened in town, no boasting, no fury. Just calm, just presence. He didn't ask why she had left. He knew already. And Ellie didn't apologize because some things were deeper than words. Later that night, when the fire had died down to embers and the rain whispered against the roof like a lullaby, she turned to him and asked, "Why did you come for me?" He didn't speak right away. He was whittling again, a small piece of pine turning slowly in his hands. Then, finally, without looking up, he said, "Because you were never something to lose. Not again." She moved closer, taking the carving from his hands. It was a bear this time, gentle-eyed, protective. "You keep giving me things that survive." She whispered. He nodded. "Because you survived me, and I survived you." That night he didn't sleep on the floor, and not out of duty or desire, but because two hearts that had learned to fear closeness finally found the courage to reach. Across the silence, they lay together, fully clothed, hands clasped, hearts exposed. There were no promises, no confessions. Only the sacred comfort of breathing in rhythm. Days passed. Then weeks. The trees bloomed again, their branches dressed in green lace. The creek gurgled with life. Ellie planted wildflowers outside the cabin. She hung curtains in the windows, white ones, made from old sheets. Gideon built her a rocking chair from leftover cedar, carved wildflowers into the arms. It squeaked when she sat in it, but she called it perfect. They settled into life, not as strangers or debtors or protectors, but as partners. Gideon showed her how to mend traps, and she taught him to knead bread. He caught her humming again, and one afternoon he joined her, a low, awkward hum that made her laugh until her ribs ached. They talked more now of the future, of what kind of vegetables they could grow, of how they might patch the roof before next winter. But sometimes they still sat in silence, just watching the wind play through the grass. One morning, Ellie walked out to Clara's grave with a small bunch of wild violets. She knelt, placed them gently, and whispered, "Thank you for keeping him safe long enough for me to find him." When Gideon found her there, he didn't speak. He just held her hand. And then, one spring day, Ellie felt something shift inside her, an ache, a flutter. Weeks later, she stood in the doorway of the cabin with tears in her eyes and said, I think I'm carrying new life." Gideon froze, his mouth parting slightly. Then he walked over to her, dropped to his knees, and placed his ear to her belly as if he could already hear a heartbeat. A child? He asked in a whisper, as if afraid the moment might break. She nodded. Hours. He looked up, eyes glassy, voice rough. You brought me back from the dead, and now you've made me a father again. She cupped his face, kissed his forehead, and smiled. You taught me what love really feels like, Gideon Thorne. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her waist, holding her like a man anchoring himself to the earth. Months passed. They painted the nursery with old brushes and clay dyes. Gideon carved a wooden cradle, every notch smoothed with care. Ellie embroidered blankets with sunflowers and foxes and bears. When the child came, a daughter with Ellie's green eyes and Gideon's quiet strength, the cabin sang with new breath. Gideon held the baby in arms that had once only known war, wilderness, and loss. Now they knew tenderness. She's got your eyes, he whispered. Ellie, weak but radiant, smiled from her bed. And your heart, the seasons turned. The child learned to crawl across the wooden floor, to laugh at the wolves howling in the distance, to fall asleep in the crook of her father's arm. One night, as Gideon tucked her into bed, he turned to Ellie by the fire and said, I still remember the day I bought you for $2. She chuckled, shaking her head. I remember thinking you were going to eat me alive. He laughed to a deep, rumbling sound that filled the room. You did more than survive. You taught me to feel again. You made me remember what it was to live. She reached out and touched his chest just over his heart. And you gave me a home. No chains, no debt, no silence. Just love. The kind that didn't need to be spoken, because it had already been carved into the walls of the cabin, the dirt of the garden, the pages of Gideon's old journals, and the tiny hand gripping his thumb as their child slept soundly between them. $2. That's what she had cost him. But in the end, she had given him everything.